October 1990. A small private dining room above a restaurant in Hudson, New York. 12 chefs from the Hudson Valley Chef Cooperative sit around an oak table eating a single dish prepared by the chef of the host restaurant, a 38-year-old man named Daniel Stanton, who was flown in from California 3 days earlier, specifically for this tasting. The dish is a slow-roasted shoulder of Red Wattle hog, finished over applewood, served with a reduction of bourbon barrel pan juice and pickled mustard greens. The hog was killed 11 days earlier on a small farm outside the town of Berea in Madison County, Kentucky. The farm is owned by a 53-year-old woman named Elsbeth Krause. She is not at the dinner. She has never been to New York. She does not know that 12 chefs are eating one of her hogs on a Wednesday night in October. The check the cooperative will mail her on Friday morning will be for $9,400, payment in full for 2 finished hogs at $4,700 each, the highest price ever paid for an American heritage breed pork at that point in the history of farm-to-table cuisine in the United States. But this story does not begin in Hudson, New York. This story begins 3 years earlier, in September of 1987, on a Saturday afternoon at the Madison County Farmers Auction Yard in Richmond, Kentucky, when Elsbeth Krause stood at the back of the livestock pens and bid $4,000 on a Red Wattle hog that no other farmer in the auction yard would touch. Elsbeth was 50 years old in September of 1987. She had lived her entire adult life on the 84-acre Krauss farm, 3 miles south of Berea, in the foothills where the bluegrass region begins to rise toward the Cumberland Plateau. She had never been married. She had never had children. She had cared for her father Heinrich Krauss from his stroke in 1979 until his death in 1983, and for her mother Margareta from Margareta's Parkinson's diagnosis in 1981 until Margareta's death in March of 1987, 6 months before the auction. Elsbeth had been alone in the farmhouse for exactly 6 months on the morning she drove the 1979 Ford F-250 pickup truck into Richmond with a folded check in her shirt pocket. She had inherited the farm and the savings account and the 1962 Massey Ferguson tractor and the small herd of Hereford cattle her father had built up over 40 years. She had inherited something else also, although nobody in Madison County knew about it yet. She had inherited the leather-bound notebooks her grandfather Verner Krauss had carried with him out of Bavaria in February of 1938, the month before Hitler annexed Austria, the year that Verner had finally understood that the Germany he had grown up in was not coming back. To understand why a 50-year-old unmarried woman in Madison County, Kentucky paid $4,000 for a single Red Wattle hog at a livestock auction in September of 1987, you have to understand who Verner Krauss was and why he had carried a stack of small leather notebooks with him on the ship from Bremen to New York, and what those notebooks contained. Verner Krause had been born in 1894 in a village called Reichenhall in Upper Bavaria, near the Austrian border. His family had been hog farmers for 6 generations. They had bred a regional German hog called the Schwäbisch Hellisches Landschwein, a black and pink saddle-backed pig with red wattle markings on the throat that had been documented in Central European agricultural records since the early 1700s. Verner's father, Anton Krause, had been the master breeder of the regional cooperative from 1908 until 1932. Verner had apprenticed under his father from age 14. He had taken over the breeding records in 1928. He had married a Bavarian woman named Clara Hartmann in 1924. They had 1 son, Heinrich, born in 1909. They had emigrated to the United States in February of 1938. Verner had been 44. Clara had been 39. Heinrich had been 28. They had landed in New York and had taken a train to Lexington, Kentucky, where Verner had been offered a position as herd manager at a large commercial hog operation outside of Lexington owned by a German-American family named Schultz. The Schultz family had paid for the Krause family's passage. The Krause family had owed them 7 years of labor in exchange. Verner had worked at the Schultz operation from 1938 until 1945. By the end of the war, Verner had saved enough to make a down payment on a small 84-acre farm 3 miles south of Berea, in Madison County, on land that the Schultz family had recommended to him. He had moved his family there in October of 1945. Clara had died in 1952 of pneumonia. Heinrich, who had married a Kentucky woman named Margareta Schmidt in 1947, had taken over the farm in 1955 when Verner was 61 and could no longer manage the heavier work. Verner had lived in a small back bedroom of the farmhouse from 1955 until his death in 1968 at age 74. Elsbeth Krause had been born in 1937 in Bavaria. She had crossed the Atlantic on the same ship as her grandparents and her father at age 11 months. She did not remember Bavaria. She had grown up speaking English at school and German at home. She had attended 1 year of community college at Eastern Kentucky University in 1955 before her mother had needed her at home. She had not gone back. She had been a careful, steady worker on the family farm for 32 years before she walked into the auction yard in September of 1987. The leather-bound notebooks Verner had brought from Bavaria contained, in his small, careful German handwriting, the breeding records of 7 generations of Schwäbisch Hellisches Landschwein pigs from 1862 through 1937. The notebooks recorded births, weights, lineage, slaughter weights, fat distribution, meat quality observations, and the specific feeding regimens that Verner's grandfather and great-grandfather had used to produce the dark, red, marbled pork that had earned the Krauss family a reputation across Upper Bavaria as one of the finest heritage pork producers in the region. The notebooks were not in English. The notebooks had been read, in their entirety, by exactly 3 people in the United States between 1938 and 1987. Verner had read them. Heinrich had read them when his father had translated portions aloud at the kitchen table in the 1950s. And Elsbeth had read them, herself, in the original German, between 1985 and 1987, after her mother's Parkinson's had progressed to the point where Margaret slept 18 hours a day, and Elsbeth had quiet time in the evenings to study at the kitchen table. Elsbeth read German fluently. Her grandfather had taught her in the back bedroom of the farmhouse when she was 8 years old. He had taught her to read his notebooks when she was 12. He had told her, in German, on his deathbed in March of 1968, that the notebooks contained something the American hog industry had forgotten. She had not understood, at age 31, what he meant. She had understood at age 50. Between 1985 and 1987, while caring for her dying mother, Elsbeth had read every page of every notebook 3 times. She had compiled, in her own composition notebooks, a 240-page summary in English of what her grandfather and his ancestors had documented. The summary covered optimal slaughter age, 24 to 30 months, not the 6 months that the modern American industry used. Optimal fat-to-lean ratio, 45% fat by carcass weight, not the 18% that the modern industry pursued. Optimal feeding regimens, acorn finishing in the autumn, dairy whey supplementation in the spring, fermented grain mash in the winter, and the specific breeds that her grandfather had identified as carrying the genetic markers for the dense marbled meat that the Bavarian master butchers of the 1880s had paid premium prices for. The Schwäbisch Hellisches Landschwein no longer existed in the United States. It had not survived the consolidation of the American hog industry between 1950 and 1980. Verner Krause had attempted to start a breeding herd in Kentucky in 1948, but had abandoned the effort in 1953 because he could not find another breeder of the variety in North America. The breed had survived in Germany, in small numbers, but Elsbeth had no realistic path to import live animals from a German breeder in 1987. What she had instead, after 14 months of correspondence with the Livestock Conservancy in North Carolina, was a list of 3 American heritage breeds that carried similar genetic characteristics: Mulefoot, Choctaw, and Red Wattle. The Red Wattle, in particular, was a Texas-Louisiana variety that had been brought to North America from New Caledonia in the 18th century, that had similar fat distribution to the Bavarian breed, and that had a population of approximately 240 breeding females remaining in the United States in 1987. The breed had been declared critical endangered by the Conservancy. Most of the remaining breeders were in Texas. There was, however, one breeder in Kentucky. A man named Wendell Boggs, age 67, who lived in Estill County, Kentucky, 42 miles east of Berea. Wendell Boggs had inherited a foundation Red Wattle boar in 1981 from a Texas breeder he had worked for in the 1960s. He had been breeding the line, alone, for 6 years. He had no buyers. He was preparing to sell off his entire herd at the Madison County Farmers Auction Yard in September of 1987 because his arthritis had progressed to the point where he could no longer manage the heavier work. Elsbeth had heard about Wendell Boggs in May of 1987 from a Livestock Conservancy newsletter. She had driven to Estill County in June. She had spent 6 hours walking Wendell's small operation. She had purchased nothing. She had returned home and spent 12 weeks studying the Boggs herd records and her grandfather's notebooks side by side. She had returned to Estill County in early September. Wendell had told her that he was selling everything at the September auction. Elsbeth had asked which animal he considered his finest breeding boar. Wendell had walked her to a pen at the back of his operation and pointed to a 38-month-old Red Wattle boar with the characteristic throat wattles, weighing approximately 480 pounds, that Wendell called Red No. 3. The boar's name in the breeding record was simply Boggs Red 3. Wendell told her that Red No. 3 was the genetic equivalent of any boar in the entire American Red Wattle population. He told her that Red No. 3 would, if bred to enough quality sows over the next 3 years, produce a regional foundation herd that could rival anything in Texas. He told her that he would set the auction reserve on Red No. 3 at $1,200 to make sure the boar did not go to a slaughter buyer. Elsbeth had nodded. She had thanked Wendell. She had driven home to Berea. She had sat at the kitchen table that evening with her grandfather's notebooks open in front of her, and she had read the section in the 1898 entries where her great-grandfather Anton had described, in his careful German, how he had spent 4 times the going market price to acquire a single foundation boar from a master breeder in Württemberg in 1879, and how that single purchase had set the genetic course of the Krauss family hogs for the next 60 years. Elsbeth had set her bid limit for Red No. 3 at $4,000. The auction was held on a Saturday morning in mid-September of 1987 at the Madison County Farmers Auction Yard, a metal pole barn structure with a sawdust floor and a circular pen at the center surrounded by tiered wooden bleachers. About 140 people were in the bleachers that morning. The crowd was the typical mix of cattle buyers, hog buyers, slaughter yard agents, and feed company representatives who attended the September auction every year. There were 6 women in the crowd. 5 of them were the wives of bidders. The 6th was Elsbeth Krause. She wore a pressed white cotton blouse and dark gray work trousers. Her dark blonde hair was pulled back in a simple braid. She carried a black leather purse her grandmother Clara had brought from Bavaria in 1938. She did not look at any of the other bidders. The auctioneer was a man named Boyd Latimer, who had been calling auctions in Madison County for 26 years. He worked through the morning lots. He sold the Hereford crosses. He sold the Angus heifers. He sold the Holstein bull calves. He moved into the hog section at 11:30. He sold the commercial York Hampshire crosses for 50 cents to 75 cents per pound. He sold the breeder gilts for higher prices. Wendell Boggs's herd of 43 Red Wattle hogs came up at 12:15. Boyd called the lot description in the flat, tired voice of a man who had been calling auctions since 7 that morning. Lot 47 through 89. Red Wattle Heritage breed hogs from the Boggs operation in Estill County. 43 head total, sold individually. Reserve prices set by the seller. The crowd shifted on the bleachers. Most of the buyers in the room had never seen a red wattle. The animals coming through the pen were larger than commercial hogs, slower, with the dark red coats and the throat wattles that gave the breed its name. Boyd called lot 47 first, a young sow. The reserve was $400. The sow sold for $425 to a feed company representative who was buying her, everyone knew, for slaughter. Lot 48, $385. Lot 49, $410. The pattern held through the next 18 lots. Wendell's reserve prices were just above slaughter market value. The hogs were going to slaughter buyers, one after the other, because no commercial hog farmer in Madison County had any use for a heritage breed that took 30 months to finish instead of 6. Lot 65 came up at $12.40. Boyd called it. Lot 65, 3-year-old proven boar, foundation breeding stock, Boggs herd record number 3, reserve $1 and $200. The crowd was quiet. Most of the buyers had stopped paying attention by then. Wendell Boggs himself was sitting in the back row of the bleachers, watching with an expression that was difficult to read. Elsbeth Krause raised her hand. $1,200. Boyd looked at her over his glasses. $1,200 to the lady in the back. Anyone $1,250. A slaughter buyer in the second row, a man named Garrett Mosley, who worked for a processor in Lexington, raised his hand without looking up. $1,250. Elsbeth raised her hand again. $1,300. Mosley shrugged. $1,350. Elsbeth, $1,400. Mosley looked at her this time. He had never seen her at the auction before. He could see, even from the second row, that she was not a commercial buyer. He bid again, more out of habit than calculation. $1,500. Elsbeth, $2,000. The crowd in the bleachers turned to look at her. $2,000 for a heritage boar that would sell for slaughter at $600 at most. Mosley hesitated. He looked at Wendell Boggs in the back row. He looked at the boar in the pen. He bid one more time, slowly, the way a man bids when he wants to see how far the other bidder will go. $2,500. Elsbeth waited 2 full seconds. $3,000. Now the crowd was completely silent. Boyd Latimer stopped chewing the toothpick in his mouth. He looked at Elsbeth. He looked at Mosley. He looked at the boar. He looked at Wendell Boggs in the back row, who had now stood up and was watching the bidding with an expression of careful attention. Mosley laughed once, a short, startled laugh, the kind of laugh a man gives when he has just realized he is in a transaction he does not understand. $3,500. Elsbeth raised her hand without speaking. $4,000. The crowd made a low collective sound, somewhere between a gasp and a murmur. Boyd Latimer waited. He looked at Mosley. Mosley shook his head and put his hand down. Boyd looked back at Elsbeth. $4,000 once, $4,000 twice. Sold to the lady at the back for $4,000. The gavel came down. Lot 65 sold to Elsbeth Krause for $4,000 cash, paid in full at the auction office that afternoon. The Chakota started before she had even loaded the boar onto the trailer. Elsbeth had backed her father's old 1973 Chevrolet stock trailer up to the auction yard loading chute at 3:15 that afternoon. She was unloading the boar with the help of a young auction yard worker named Junior Pollard, age 19, when 3 farmers from a neighboring township in Madison County walked past on their way to the cattle pens. The first farmer was a man named Calvin Rourke, 58, who had farmed 240 acres of corn and hogs east of Berea for 31 years. He stopped at the loading chute. He looked at the Red Wattle boar walking down the chute into the trailer. He looked at Elsbeth holding the lead rope. He looked at the auction sale tag on the boar's ear. Calvin spoke loud enough for the other 2 farmers, and the auction yard worker, and 4 men sitting on the fence 40 feet away to hear. $4,000 for a hog that looks like it crawled out of a swamp. The 2 farmers behind Calvin laughed. They laughed the way farmers laugh in front of other farmers, a short, hard laugh that is meant to be heard. Junior Pollard did not laugh. He kept holding the back gate of the trailer open. The four men on the fence laughed. The laugh traveled across the loading area. By the time Elsbeth had latched the trailer gate and walked to the cab of her truck, 15 people in the auction yard had heard the laugh, had looked toward her trailer, and had filed away in their own memories the image of the Krauss woman from Berea, paying $4,000 at the auction for what Calvin Rourke had called the swamp pig. Elsbeth drove home. She did not look back. She did not respond to Calvin Rourke. She did not respond to the men on the fence. She unloaded red number 3 at her own farm at 5 that afternoon. She walked the boar to the breeding pen she had built behind the barn over the previous 3 months. A pen with concrete floor sloped for drainage, a wooden A-frame shelter, a freshwater trough she had filled that morning, and a feeding station stocked with the specific feed mix her grandfather's notebooks had described as appropriate for a foundation boar in active use. Red number 3 walked into the pen, sniffed the food, ate, drank water, and lay down in the shelter. He was 480 pounds of foundation breeding stock for a herd that did not yet exist. He had cost Elsbeth $4,000. She had paid the check from the savings account that her father had left her. She had $11,400 remaining. She would need every penny of it over the next 3 years. The story of the Krauss woman and the $4,000 pig spread across Madison County in the same way these stories always spread in rural Kentucky in the late 1980s, which was through the post office and the feed mill and the Saturday morning coffee shop in Berea and the Sunday potlucks at the Methodist church. By the end of September, every farmer within 20 miles of Berea had heard. The story took on the particular tone that small Kentucky communities reserve for unmarried women who do unexpected things with money they have inherited from their parents. It was not the cruel tone. It was the patronizing tone, the tone of a community that had been watching Elsbeth Krause for 30 years and had concluded that she had been alone in that farmhouse for long enough that her judgment was beginning to slip. Calvin Rourke himself, the farmer who had laughed at the loading chute, told the story at the Berea feed mill on the following Tuesday morning to the 8 men gathered around the coffee pot. He told it well. He included the part about the swamp pig. He included the part about the $4,000. He did not include the part where Elsbeth had not responded, had not laughed, had not even looked at him. Calvin's version of the story made Elsbeth into a sentimental old maid who had bought a dying breed because she felt sorry for the animal. The men at the feed mill nodded. They had heard versions of this story before. They knew what it meant. They expected, accurately, that Elsbeth would lose money on the boar, would be unable to find sows of the same breed to mate with, and would, within 2 years, have a small failed heritage hog operation that the community would absorb back into the regular hog economy of Madison County. They were wrong about all 3. Elsbeth Krause spent the autumn of 1987 doing 2 things. She drove the F-250 4 times to Estill County to purchase Red Wattle gilts from Wendell Boggs, who was selling off his remaining herd at private treaty rather than at auction. She purchased 4 gilts at $600 each, for a total of $2,400. She also drove twice to Tennessee, where she purchased 2 more Red Wattle gilts from a breeder she had located through the Livestock Conservancy in eastern Tennessee for $700 each. By the end of November of 1987, she had red number 3 plus 6 Red Wattle gilts on her farm. The total invested capital, including the $4,000 boar, was $7,800. She had $7,600 remaining in the savings account. The first breeding cycle began in February of 1988. By June of 1988, 4 of the 6 gilts had farrowed litters totaling 28 piglets. By the autumn of 1988, 2 of the remaining gilts had farrowed second litters. By the end of 1988, Elsbeth had red number 3 plus 6 sows plus 36 finishing pigs of various ages, all on the 84-acre farm. The second thing Elsbeth had done in the autumn of 1987 was begin a correspondence with 3 institutions. The first was the Livestock Conservancy itself, which agreed to register her foundation herd as one of 7 recognized Red Wattle breeders in the southeastern United States. The second was a small culinary research center at Appalachian State University in North Carolina that had begun, in 1986, to study the use of heritage breed pork in regional Appalachian cuisine. The third was a man named Theodore Hanover, age 41, who had opened a small farm-to-table restaurant in Lexington, Kentucky in 1985, and who had been mentioned in the September 1987 issue of Bon Appetit magazine as a chef to watch. Elsbeth had read the Bon Appetit article in the Berea Public Library 3 weeks after the auction. She had written to Theodore Hanover at the address listed on his restaurant stationery, which she had obtained by writing a polite letter to the magazine and asking. The letter Elsbeth wrote to Theodore Hanover in October of 1987 was 3 paragraphs long. She introduced herself. She explained that she was beginning a small heritage breed pork operation outside of Berea. She explained that her grandfather had been a master heritage hog breeder in Bavaria before emigrating in 1938. She offered, when her first finishing pigs reached slaughter weight in 1989 or 1990, to send him a small sample shipment at no charge for him to evaluate. Theodore Hanover received the letter. He read it twice. He set it aside. He had received many letters from many farmers in his first 3 years of running the restaurant. He had learned to wait before responding. He waited 18 months. He drove out to the Krauss farm in March of 1989 on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, after he had heard about Elsbeth a second time, this time from a food writer at the Lexington Herald-Leader who had visited the Madison County Cooperative Extension Office and had been told about a heritage breed operation south of Berea. Theodore drove down a gravel driveway. He saw the farmhouse. He saw the small red barn. He saw the breeding pens. He saw Red Number 3, who was now 4.5 years old and weighed approximately 580 pounds, lying in his pen in the afternoon sun. He saw the sows in the next pen. He saw the finishing pigs in a third pen in various stages of growth, from 6-month-olds to 18-month-olds. He stood in the driveway for 15 minutes before Elsbeth came out of the farmhouse to meet him. She had been canning tomatoes. She had not heard the truck. She wiped her hands on her apron. Mr. Hanover. Theodore had been expecting an older woman. He was surprised. She was 51 in March of 1989, but she had the steady, direct eyes of a woman who had spent her life paying attention to specific things. He introduced himself. He explained that he had received her letter 18 months earlier. He apologized for not responding. He asked if he could see the operation. Elsbeth walked him through the breeding pens. She explained the genetics. She explained the feeding program. She explained the relationship between the Red Wattle bloodlines and the Bavarian heritage records her grandfather had carried out of Germany in 1938. Theodore listened for 2 hours. He had eaten heritage pork once in his life, in France, at a restaurant in Lyon in 1981. He had not tasted anything like it before or since. He understood, standing in the breeding pen with Elsbeth Krause on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1989, that he was looking at the first American producer he had encountered who appeared to understand what heritage pork actually was. He asked if he could buy a finishing hog. Elsbeth told him that her first 3 finishing hogs would be ready for slaughter in the autumn of 1989, when they reached the 28-month mark her grandfather's notebooks specified. Theodore offered to pay $800 for the first one, sight unseen. Elsbeth agreed. The first slaughter occurred in October of 1989. Elsbeth used a small custom processor in Lincoln County who had been recommended to her by Wendell Boggs. The hog finished at 612 pounds live weight, with a hanging weight of 470 pounds, a yield that was lower than commercial hogs because of the older slaughter age, but with carcass fat distribution that was. When Theodore Hanover received the cuts at his restaurant the following Saturday morning, unlike anything he had seen on an American hog. The fat was creamy white. The marbling was dense and even. The meat was a deep red verging on rose. He cooked a shoulder section that night, slow roasted for 9 hours over applewood, and he served it to a table of 6 guests, 2 of whom were food writers from Louisville, and 1 of whom was a chef who happened to be visiting from the Hudson Valley. The Hudson Valley Chef was a man named Marcus Whitfield, who ran a 40-seat restaurant in Hudson, New York, and who had been part of a loose, informal group of Hudson Valley chefs who had begun, in 1988, to organize joint sourcing efforts in order to access better farm-to-table ingredients. Marcus Whitfield ate the shoulder of Krauss hog in Theodore Hanover's Lexington restaurant on a Saturday night in October of 1989. He did not finish the meal at the table. He went into Theodore's kitchen at the end of the meal, and he asked Theodore who the producer was. Theodore wrote Elsbeth's name and address on the back of a check. Marcus Whitfield drove to Berea on a Wednesday morning in November of 1989. He spent 4 hours with Elsbeth on the farm. He took photographs. He took notes. He asked her detailed questions about her grandfather's records, her feeding program, her breeding plan for the next 3 years. He drove back to New York. He met with the Hudson Valley Chef Cooperative the following week. He told them what he had seen. The cooperative had 24 chefs in 1989. It would have 12 chefs at the dinner in October of 1990 because 11 of the original members had been unable to fit the trip into their schedules. Marcus Whitfield called Elsbeth in December of 1989. He said the cooperative wanted to commit to purchasing her entire 1990 finishing output. He named a price. The price was $4,700 per finished hog. Elsbeth, sitting in the kitchen of the farmhouse on a December afternoon with the phone receiver in her hand, did the math she had been preparing to do for 2 years. 28 finishing hogs at $4,700 each was $131,600. Less feed costs of approximately $34,000 across the year, less veterinary, supplies, and processing costs of approximately $11,000. Net income of approximately $86,600 from her foundation herd of 1 boar and 6 sows 3 years after the auction. Marcus Whitfield. Yes, Mrs. Krause, I have been alone on this farm for almost 3 years. My mother died in March of 1987. My father died in 1983. My grandfather died in 1968. He carried the records of 7 generations of heritage hog breeding out of Bavaria in 1938. He carried them in leather notebooks. He kept them in the back bedroom of our farmhouse for 30 years. Nobody in this country read them except him and my father and me. Now you and 12 other chefs in New York want to pay me $4,700 per hog for what those notebooks taught me. I want to tell you something. The hogs are not why my grandfather kept those notebooks. He kept them because his father had kept them. He kept them because somewhere in the act of keeping them, the family stayed connected to a piece of land in Bavaria that we will never see again. The hogs were a record of a place. The notebooks are the record of a family. I have kept the family alive on this farm for 51 years. I am happy to sell you the hogs at the price you are offering. I will use the money to keep the farm. But I want you to know that I am not selling you the hogs. I am selling you a small fraction of what those notebooks contain. The actual contents of the notebooks are not for sale. They are for the next generation of my family, whoever that will turn out to be, whenever that turns out to happen. Marcus Whitfield was quiet on the line for a long moment. He had not expected the speech. He understood he had received an answer that was both a yes and a careful private warning. He acknowledged it without saying anything specific. The contract was signed in January of 1990. The first delivery was made in April, the second in June, the third in August, the fourth in October, which was the delivery that resulted in the Chef Cooperative dinner in Hudson on a Wednesday night in October, when 12 chefs from the Hudson Valley Chef Cooperative ate one of Elsbeth's hogs and discussed, after the meal, the possibility of commissioning a 50-hog annual contract for 1991. Elsbeth never went to the Hudson dinner. She had a 14-year-old neighbor girl named Hattie Pelum, helping her on the farm by then, who had appeared one Saturday afternoon in March of 1989 at the gate of the Krauss farm and had asked if she could help with the pigs in exchange for nothing in particular. Hattie Pelum was the daughter of a Berea schoolteacher named Elsbeth Pelum and a Madison County electrician named Hugh Pelum. Hattie had been failing in school. She had been spending afternoons walking the back roads instead of going home. She had stopped at the Krauss farm one afternoon because she had heard from a friend at school that the strange Krauss ladies south of Berea had Red Wattle pigs that looked like pictures from old books. Elsbeth had let Hattie into the breeding pen on the first afternoon. Hattie had not been afraid of the pigs. She had not been afraid of Red number 3. She had asked good questions. She had stayed for 3 hours. She had come back the following Saturday. She had come back every Saturday for 4 months. By the autumn of 1989, Hattie was at the Krauss farm 5 days a week after school and full days on weekends. By the winter of 1989, Hattie was reading her way through Verner Krauss's notebooks with a German-English dictionary at the kitchen table. Elsbeth taught her German on Saturday mornings. By the autumn of 1990, when the Hudson Valley contract was signed and the first $9,400 check arrived in the mail, Hattie was 15 and was the second person in 52 years to read Verner Krauss's notebooks in their original German. Elsbeth set aside, from that first $9,400 check, a sum of $2,000 that she put into a small savings account in Hattie's name. Hattie did not know about the account until Hattie was 22, by which time the account had grown, with annual contributions from every Krauss apiary harvest year, to approximately $48,000. Hattie used the money to attend the College of Agriculture at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, where she earned a bachelor's degree in animal science in 1999, and where she would meet, in her sophomore year, a young man from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, who was studying agroecology and who would, eventually, become her husband. Although that is a different story. Elsbeth Krause continued to operate the Red Wattle herd from 1990 onward. By 1995, she was supplying 11 restaurants across the eastern United States. By 2000, the operation had grown to 380 finishing hogs per year. The price per hog had stabilized, in the heritage breed market, at approximately $5,200 in real dollars. The Krause Heritage Hog Farm was earning, by the year 2000, approximately $100,000 to $400,000 per year in gross revenue against operating costs of approximately $510,000 for a net of $890,000 annually. Elsbeth was 63 years old in 2000. She had, in the 11 years since the first sale to Theodore Hanover, made more money than she had thought existed. She had also, more importantly to her, fulfilled what she had come to understand by 1990 as her actual purpose in inheriting the farm. The actual purpose had not been the money. The actual purpose had been to bring the Krause family knowledge back into use. Verner Krause had carried the leather notebooks out of Bavaria in February of 1938, not to sell them, not to make money from them, not to publish them, but to keep them alive in case there came a moment when the knowledge they contained would be needed again. The moment had taken 49 years. The moment had arrived on a Saturday morning in September of 1987 at the Madison County Farmers Auction Yard, when a 50-year-old unmarried woman in a pressed white blouse had raised her hand to bid $4,000 on a foundation boar that the rest of her county had laughed at. The laugh had not been the point. The bid had been the point. The bid was the moment when the Krause family knowledge had crossed back from the leather notebooks into the active world. Calvin Rourke, the farmer who had laughed at the loading chute on the September afternoon in 1987, drove past the Krause farm one Sunday morning in the autumn of 1995, 8 years after the auction, on his way to a hardware store in Richmond. He had heard the stories. He had heard about the New York chefs. He had heard the dollar figures. He had not believed them. He drove past the Krauss farm slowly that morning. He saw the breeding pens. He saw the long red-painted finishing barn that Elsbeth had built in 1992. He saw the additional 60 acres of pasture that she had purchased in 1993 from the neighboring property to the south. He saw, parked in the gravel driveway, a new 1993 GMC Sierra pickup truck. He saw, in the back of the truck, the same black leather purse he had seen Elsbeth carrying at the auction yard in 1987. Calvin Rourke pulled into the driveway. He turned off the engine. He sat in his truck for 10 minutes. He got out. He walked up to the porch. He knocked on the door. Elsbeth answered. She was 58 in the autumn of 1995. She was wearing a denim work shirt and the same braided dark blonde hair, now showing more silver at the temples. Calvin Rourke. Elsbeth. I do not know if you remember me. I remember you, Calvin. He stood on the porch. He had the cap in his hands. I want to apologize for what I said at the auction yard in 1987. The thing about the swamp pig. Elsbeth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You do not need to apologize, Calvin. The community thought what the community thought." I understood. He shook his head. The community was wrong. I want to say that out loud. I was wrong. I want you to hear me say it. Elsbeth nodded. She did not invite him in. She did not need to. She had not been waiting for the apology. She had not been carrying the laugh as a wound. She had simply continued the work, which was the only response a person could ever offer to a community's misjudgment of the work she was actually doing. Calvin stood on the porch for another moment. Mrs. Krause. Yes, Calvin, your grandfather, the one who came from Germany. Yes, he must have been an extraordinary man. He was an ordinary man, said Elsbeth. He had a family record that he kept up. He carried it with him when he had to leave. The family record turned out to be useful again, 50 years later, when nobody else in this country had what was in it. That is what families do when they are paying attention. They keep the records. The records eventually return. Calvin nodded slowly. He thanked her. He drove home. He never made another comment about the Krauss operation in his life. He died in 2003 at age 74 of a stroke. His own son, who took over the Rourke farm in 2003, called Elsbeth that same year and asked if she would consider mentoring him on whether the Rourke operation could transition to a Red Wattle program. Elsbeth told him yes. She helped the Rourke operation make the transition between 2003 and 2008. By 2010, there were 6 Red Wattle operations in Madison County. All of them descended from Red No. 3's bloodlines, all of them in some way connected to the leather notebooks Verner Krauss had carried out of Bavaria in February of 1938. Hattie Pelum came back to the Krauss farm in 2003 after 4 years working at a heritage breed conservancy in Vermont. She had been 14 when she had first walked through the gate. She was 28 when she came back. Elsbeth was 66. The agreement they made was simple. Hattie would take over daily management of the Krauss Heritage Hog Farm. Elsbeth would continue to live in the farmhouse, would continue to walk the breeding pens every morning, would continue to read her grandfather's notebooks at the kitchen table on winter evenings. She would also begin, with Hattie, the project of translating Verner Krauss's notebooks fully into English and preparing them for publication as a heritage breed reference manual. The project took 11 years. The book was published in 2014 by a small university press in Lexington under the title Krauss Heritage Pork, 7 Generations of Bavarian Hog Breeding Records, 1862 to 2014. The book ran 480 pages. It included Verner's original German entries from 1862 through 1937 in facsimile, with English translations on facing pages, plus Elsbeth's English entries from 1987 through 2014, plus Hattie's emerging entries from 2003 forward. The book was reviewed in the New York Times Book Review under the headline, A Family Record of Disappearance and Recovery. Elsbeth Krause died in February of 2018 in her sleep at age 80. Hattie was 43 by then. Hattie had a daughter, Margaret Pelum Yoder, born in 2008, named after Elsbeth's mother. Margaret was 9 years old when Elsbeth died. Margaret is 16 in 2025. Margaret walks the breeding pens every Saturday morning with her mother, the way Hattie had walked them every Saturday morning with Elsbeth between 1989 and 2003. Margaret is reading Verner Krauss's notebooks in their original German. She is the third generation of the family that includes the Krause and the Pelum bloodlines, even though she is not biologically descended from Verner Krause, because the family has come to understand, by 2025, that family is what you carry forward, and not only what you are born into. Hattie Pelum Yoder, in 2025, runs the Krause Heritage Hog Farm with her daughter Margaret, with her husband Reuben Yoder, and with 3 full-time employees. The operation supplies 14 restaurants across the eastern United States. The Hudson Valley Chef Cooperative, which had ordered the first contract in 1990, no longer exists in its original form, but 4 of the original 12 chefs from the October 1990 dinner are still running their own restaurants in 2025, and all 4 still buy Krause hogs every year, in autumn, exactly as Marcus Whitfield had ordered them in 1990. Hattie sits at the kitchen table in the Krause farmhouse on Sunday evenings, the way Elsbeth had sat between 1985 and 1987, reading her grandfather's notebooks. Hattie is now reading the notebooks for the 3rd time in 26 years. She is still finding things in them she had missed before. She is also, as Elsbeth taught her in 1991, keeping her own notebooks, in English, in the same kind of small, leather-bound volumes that Verner had used. The notebooks are stored in a lockbox in the bedroom that had been Verner's back bedroom from 1955 until his death in 1968. The lockbox key hangs on a small hook beside the kitchen sink, exactly where Heinrich Krause had hung it in 1968 when his father had handed him the key 2 weeks before Verner had died. The key has not been moved in 57 years. The key will be handed to Margaret when Hattie decides Margaret is ready, the way the key was handed to Elsbeth in 1985 by her dying mother, who had received it from Heinrich in 1979. The chain has held for 4 generations now. The notebooks have crossed an ocean. The notebooks have crossed a war. The notebooks have crossed 5 decades of an American hog industry that did not want them. The notebooks have crossed 2 generations of a Kentucky farm family that did not always know how to use them. They have arrived in 2025 at a 16-year-old girl named Margaret Pelum Yoder, who reads German fluently because her mother insisted, and who walks the Krause farm at sunrise on Saturday mornings, with the patience that Elsbeth Krause had carried in her into the auction yard on a September morning in 1987, when she had paid $4,000 for a single Red Wattle hog that the rest of her county had laughed at, because she had understood, with the certainty that comes only from having read the right notebooks at the right kitchen table, that the laugh was about to become irrelevant, and that the laugh would, in due time, be replaced by the silence that follows when a community has finally understood what it had been watching all along. Hattie Pelum Yoder, when asked, in a 2024 interview with a small Kentucky agricultural magazine, what the most important lesson of the Krause Heritage Hog Farm had been, did not give the answer the interviewer expected. She did not talk about the heritage breeds. She did not talk about the chefs. She did not talk about the dollar figures. She talked about a 14-year-old girl who had walked up the gravel driveway of a strange farm in March of 1989 and had asked a 51-year-old unmarried woman if she could help with the pigs. Hattie said in the interview, "The lesson is not about pigs. The lesson is about who is paying attention." Elsbeth Krause was paying attention to me before I knew I was paying attention to her. She had been alone in that farmhouse for 2.5 years when I walked through the gate. She had been alone for 52 years, in some ways, because she had been the only person in her family alive who could read her grandfather's notebooks. She had been waiting for someone to walk up the driveway. I did not know that. I was 14. I was failing in school. I was walking the back roads because home was hard. I walked up her driveway because the friend at school had said something that caught my attention. The friend's name was Brittany Lassiter. Brittany Lassiter had said the pigs at the Krauss farm looked like pictures from old books. That was enough. That was all it took. Hattie paused in the interview. She continued, "The lesson is that you do not know, when you are 14, that you are about to become part of a story that is 50 years older than you. You do not know that the woman at the top of the driveway has been waiting for you, in a sense, for 2.5 years, and in another sense, for her entire life. You only know that the gate is there, and that you can walk through it. Most 14-year-olds do not walk through the gate. Most adults do not either. Most people drive past the strange farms in their county for 50 years, and never once turn into the driveway. The lesson of Elsbeth Krause's life is that the work waits. The work waits in the leather notebooks. The work waits in the breeding pens. The work waits in the back bedroom of the farmhouse where her grandfather had lived for 13 years. The work waits, sometimes for 50 years, sometimes for 100. The work waits for someone to walk up the driveway and ask if they can help with the pigs. When that person walks up the driveway, the work begins again. That is the lesson. The work waits. You walk up the driveway. The work begins. Hattie Pelum is 51 years old in 2025, the same age that Elsbeth Krause was when Hattie had first walked up the driveway in 1989. She walks the breeding pens at 5:30 every morning, the way Elsbeth had walked them at 5:30 every morning for 3 decades. Margaret walks them with her on weekend mornings. The Krauss farmhouse, which had been built in 1893 by the Schultz family who had originally owned the land, still stands. The wood floors creak in the same places they had creaked when Verner Krauss first walked across them in October of 1945. The kitchen table is the same table where Elsbeth had read her grandfather's notebooks between 1985 and 1987. The leather notebooks themselves, Verner's original 7 volumes from 1862 through 1937, are now stored in a climate-controlled archive at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, where they have been since 2014, but copies of every page sit in a wooden box on the kitchen table for daily reference. The Red Wattle herd has grown to 412 breeding hogs by 2025, distributed across the original 84 acres, plus the 60 acres purchased in 1993, plus an additional 120 acres purchased in 2009 from the Pelum family farm to the north, when Hugh Pelum, Hattie's father, had retired. The total Krauss Heritage Hog Farm property is now 264 acres. The annual gross revenue is approximately $3.2 million. The net income, after taxes and reinvestment, is approximately $1.6 million annually. None of which, Hattie has said in multiple interviews, is the point. The point is the lesson. The work waits. You walk up the driveway. The work begins. The men who laughed at the Madison County Farmers Auction Yard on a Saturday afternoon in September of 1987 had not understood that they were watching a 50-year-old unmarried woman do exactly that. They had not understood that the Krauss woman from Berea was, in the act of paying $4,000 for a single Red Wattle hog, walking up a driveway that her grandfather had built for her in 1938 when he had carried 7 volumes of leather-bound breeding records out of Bavaria onto a ship at the port of Bremen. They had not understood that the work had been waiting for 49 years. They had not understood that the laugh in the auction yard, which had felt to them like a verdict on Elsbeth Krause's judgment, had actually been the sound that small communities make when the work is about to begin again. and they have not yet realized that they are about to be left behind by a person who had been paying attention to something they had not noticed. Calvin Rourke understood this in October of 1995, when he stood on the porch of the Krauss farmhouse with his cap in his hand. He understood it 8 years late. Most of the men who had laughed in 1987 never understood it at all. Several of them died without understanding it. Their grandchildren, in some cases, came to understand it when they read the 2014 book, or when they ate Krauss heritage pork at a restaurant in Lexington, or Louisville, or New York, or when they drove past the Krauss farm with their own children and pointed and said, "This is the farm where the lady kept the pigs nobody wanted." And what happened next is the reason why we still have heritage breed pork in this part of Kentucky. The story is told that way now, in 2025, in Madison County. The laugh is no longer part of the story. The laugh, like all laughs of small communities at people doing work that the community does not understand, has faded into the silence that follows the work. The work itself remains. The work is the only thing that ever remains. And the work, when it is the right work, is always older than the laugh. That is the lesson of Elsbeth Krause's life. That is the only lesson she ever cared to give. And she gave it, in the end, not in a speech, not in an interview, not in a book, but in the simple act of walking the breeding pens at 5:30 every morning for 31 years. Until a 14-year-old girl named Hattie Pelum walked through the gate one Saturday afternoon in March of 1989 and asked if she could help with the pigs, and the work, which had been waiting since February of 1938, began again.